Welcome to the Way of the Taibhsear Podcast. This is episode 53 with Selena Fox of Circle Sanctuary for our special Samhain edition. This week's Celtic goddess is the Morrigan. The Morrigan is the phantom queen of the British Isles and a triple goddess, along with Maeve and Macha. The Morrigan was the archetype for Morgan Le Fay of the Arthurian legend. She's a psychopomp, which is to say that she conducts the souls of the dead, especially fallen warriors, to the other world. It was said that if a warrior on the way to battle saw the Morrigan washing his clothes in the river, he was about to die. She's the goddess of battle, strife, and fertility. While Briad is the matron goddess of the Druids, the Morrigan is the goddess of the Order of the Taibhsear. Since the Morrigan is a psychopomp, having the ability to walk between the worlds, and since our order is one of vision seekers and seers, the Morrigan guides us in our quest. Plants sacred to the Morrigan include blackthorn, hawthorn, and any thorny shrub. In her psychopomp aspect, the Morrigan appears as a raven or a crow. Invoke the Morrigan in shamanistic journeying and in matters of grief. If she appears to you, exercise caution in your dealings and be prepared to explore the darker side of reality. Hi, this is Shenka, inviting you to join me for the first gathering of the Bards. The first annual gathering of the Bards is a poetry, prose, and songwriting contest. Prizes will be awarded in each category. Our special musical guest for our 2017 event will be Mama Gina. Those of you who know and love her music will also be familiar with Nine Toes the Bard, who I hear will also be present at this gathering. Come join us in Greenville, South Carolina on Saturday, October 14th, 2017. for a day of music, storytelling, pirating, and good old-fashioned fun. If you're interested in vending, performing, or volunteering for the Gathering of the Bards, we're now taking applications for vendors, entertainers, and volunteers. To learn more or to purchase tickets, visit gatheringofthebards.com. Hope to see you there. Hello and welcome to the Way of the Taibhsear. My guest today is Selena Fox of Circle Sanctuary. Selena, I understand you're the founder of Circle Sanctuary, so could you tell us a little bit about what that organization is?
Yeah, Circle Sanctuary is an international resource center and church that is headquartered on a 200-acre nature preserve in southwestern Wisconsin. I founded Circle Sanctuary back in 1974 to be a place that could bring together people of many paths and places to celebrate nature in sacred ways and to have mutual support and friendship. Over the years, Circle Sanctuary has grown in its various projects and endeavors, in addition to being an organization that regularly holds events at its own headquarters on Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve, which is the land where we're based. We also help sponsor events in other places. We partner with some other pagan organizations in a variety of different events, such as Pagan Pride Days, and we're very active in pagan rights work through our Lady Liberty League, endeavoring not only to fight discrimination against pagan people, but to do public education and other work to help dispel misunderstanding and bring about better relations in society as a whole.
Yes. My son is in the Army, and he served in Afghanistan and Iraq. And could you just talk a little bit about Circle Sanctuary's involvement with the monument for deceased veterans?
Yes, and thanks to your son for his service.
Yeah.
We have been involved in military ministries for pagans and their families since our earliest days back in the 1970s.
Great. Something else I wanted to talk to you about was the Pagan Spirit Gathering. I understand that's one of the largest, if not the largest, gatherings in the United States. Could you say a little about that?
Yes, Pagan Spirit Gathering is a week-long celebration of pagan spirituality and the summer solstice. It began in 1980. It has been held at a variety of different locations over the years. It was in Wisconsin for a number of years. It was in Ohio, Missouri, and most recently in northern Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
We have authors from many different pagan traditions speaking, as well as other teachers and pagan leaders doing workshops, facilitating rituals, facilitating discussions, doing specific trainings in different areas. We have a youth program. We have vendors, arts and crafts people, and have a whole magical marketplace as part of our gathering. And like many gatherings, we have dancing and drumming around bonfires. We have pagan musicians that are doing concerts, as well as informal sessions together, jamming, sharing music, creating music together. Pagan Spirit Gathering, in many ways, is what I've called my ongoing utopian pagan social psychology experiment.
Yeah.
We have certain principles that we all agree to by registering for the gathering, respecting each other, respecting different paths, respecting nature, some really basic values.
Yeah.
And we seek to walk our talk, to live our values with all this convergence of diversity and be in good relation with each other for the week. Well, we've always held it in some type of natural setting, sometimes private land, sometimes a campground, sometimes, most recently, it's a reenactment venue site. And what we endeavored to do is be in good relation not only with each other, but that larger circle of the natural world that are part of which we're connected with. And we have been doing this since 1980, and it's grown a lot. This year, in 2012, we had our largest Pagan Spirit Gathering yet. We had over 1,000 people.
Wow.
And it's not only people from across the United States. While it's primarily a national gathering, since its beginnings, we've had people from at least one or other countries, and we regularly now get people not only from Canada, but across the waters. So it's really exciting to have a bit of that convergence of paganism as world religion and world people right together in the United States at the summer solstice event.
Yeah, speaking of across the pond, the way I first heard about the Pagan Spirit Gathering was through Dave the Bard's website. He was playing there, so you have people from all over.
He's great, and we've had many great discussions about Druidism and paganism. We had a panel at the Pagan Spirit Gathering, also known as PSG, this past year on paganism around the world. And he and his wife were among the panelists. I was there, Patrick McCollum, Margot Adler. We had a variety of different people at the Pagan, from Pagans Tonight radio network. And what we endeavored to do was share our perspectives and our experiences traveling around the world and connecting with pagans in different community settings. It was really fascinating, and I really do think that's one of the future directions of paganism, to have those of many places find even more ways of sharing information and support with each other.
Yeah, so Dave was on the show, and he was talking about he travels quite a bit as a musician, and that he could go any place in the world, and there was a common spirit there in the pagan communities across the world for all of the places that he's traveled, and that's great to hear.
I agree.
And you had mentioned that you have several Druidic practices that you engage in, and most people know you more as I don't know if you would call it Wiccan, but maybe eclectic Wiccan. Could you say a little more about your own Druidic practices?
Yes, I really see my practice of what I am now calling circlecraft is not only drawing on traditions that those who might prefer to call their path Wicca or witchcraft have some commonalities with, but Druidism and heathenism is also part of the mix. And part of that is that the circlecraft tradition, which I helped birth many years ago, is a convergence of both old forms of paganism and new forms. Mm-hmm. And with my own background in the mental health sciences, there's not only shamanism and that form of healing, but transpersonal psychology is part of the mix.
Yes.
The Druidism, for me, came from a very early age and pretty much relates to the practice across many different Druid traditions and paths of having sacred relationships with trees.
Yes.
And from the very earliest age, it's less tree worship, it's more tree communion, and seeing trees as wisdom carriers,
yes,
plants that we can have relationship with, but it's less us being in charge of tree management, more developing a mutually respecting and connecting relationship with these other beings in our world.
Yes.
As I have done ancestral research, both genealogical as well as doing meditative and shamanic journeying to connect with my biological ancestors, I have come to know about some Druidic connections from the past, in particular on my father's mother's side, one of the families from Old Scotland,
yes,
has roots connected with honoring the divine as Brige or bride. They were keepers of her holy place, one of her places in Fife, Scotland, and I still have relatives in that part of the world to this day.
Yes.
And I found out about that much later, after I had already been connected and starting to do work with that particular form of the divine. So whether you call her Bride, Brige, Bridget, or by some other of her many names,
yes,
she has been very much important part of my own spiritual work and part of my own practice of pagan spirituality with her connects me not only with Wiccans that work with her and Druids that work with her, but Christians that work with her as Saint Bridget.
Yes.
When I was at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999, I was one of the speakers at this international interreligious conference, and I gave a presentation on Bridget as Celtic goddess and Christian saint. And I got a lot of people turning out, not just the pagans, as you would expect, that were there from a number of different countries around the world. But yes, I had Roman Catholic nuns, and I had people from other religions as well. Yeah. What I thought was really wonderful was there was an international celebration of the divine feminine. And it was just really fabulous to see that sacred force, that goddess, being not, I saw myself as just a vehicle in which to have her power and her lore and her wonderful magic being made available to more people. So it was wonderful to see people have an interest in the divine feminine and in her in particular. So part of my own personal Druidic practice is very connected with her, and one of the trees connected with her is the oak. And on my father's side, I am from the Bissett clan, which has as its symbol a great oak that's been cut off but is sprouting green again.
That's
my very first pagan publication, Circle Magic Songs, a little songbook of some music that myself and my previous partner, who helped start Circle with me, Jim Allen, I reproduced the family crest that was brought over from Scotland way back in 1700s and 1800s. At least we know it goes back that far. When my great-grandfather came over from Scotland, he brought a reproduction of that image.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's a personal family symbol to have that oak sprouting green again. But the reason I put it in Circle Magic Songs, the songbook, is, to me, it's a symbol of paganism. Not just Druidism, but paganism as a whole, and how we're growing green again.
Yeah.
We are sprouting forth and growing again.
As far as your ancestors, this is the Samhain episode, and one of the topics that we discuss is the ancestors. How do we honor the ancestors? And Druids have a pretty strong tradition of honoring the ancestors. And I know you incorporate some Druidic elements into your practice. So do you have any particular things that you do to honor your ancestors at this time of the year?
Yes, one of the things that I do each year at Samhain is to create a special Samhain ancestors altar.
Yes.
And I put on the altar photographs of ancestors, as well as objects that I've had passed down to me. So I have some heirlooms, I have some photographs, or for ancestors that I've been fortunate enough to get images of before the advent of photography. I will have some reproductions of some paintings and some other renderings of ancestors, and I gather these ancestral mementos and place them on a fairly large altar in my home. In the center, I have a plate and a chalice and a votive candle. During the course of Samhain, which I do what I call the time-release Samhain. Yes, some people will celebrate it on the October 31st date in the Northern Hemisphere. Some Druids that I have friendships with will actually celebrate it at the full moon closes, and we do have a Samhain full moon this year. And some will actually celebrate it more like November 6th or 7th. Well, for myself, I start celebrating Samhain and setting up altars and decorating my home coming around the time of my birthday, which is October 20th, and then carry that Samhain celebration through pretty close to the 7th or 8th of November, and then I shift gears and honor Veterans Day. So we got to shift in a different way. So I have an altar. I take some of the food and the beverages that are served at different meals during the Samhain time, and I place them on that place setting. And then towards the end of the Samhain celebration, and sometimes it's October 31st and sometimes it's November 1st, I will take those offerings and I will place them out in a sacred place outdoors. I also have Samhain as a time of doing what I call ancestral portal work.
Mm-hmm. Could you say more about that?
Personal rituals, group rituals. I will have a time during a ceremony in which I specifically honor all ancestors, but then do some linking in with a particular ancestor.
Yes, okay. Sounds fantastic. We do something which we call the Ancestor Vigil, where we light candles and tell stories about our ancestors who have gone on. And but other than that, we do a great deal of similar practices to what you do. So do you find that that's a common way of doing this throughout the world with the people that you've talked to?
Yes, I've been over the last few years have been developing even more ancestor workshops and ceremonies, not only for my personal use, but that I've presented at different festivals. I have a radio show called Circle Craft Study that happens on Tuesday nights, and one of the things I'll be doing this year is, also doing a kind of ancestor workshop on the air, and then there'll be a podcast where people can listen later, whenever that might be. So I see ancestral connections and reverence, honoring, and communion as something that can be a connecting and common ground for pagans of different paths.
Yes.
I also find, as part of the ancestor work that I do, and when I'm doing ancestor workshops, I point out three aspects of the ancestors, three types of the ancestors. There are ancestors of family and blood, so whether we're adopted into a family or we're biologically descended from ancestors in a family, they would be the family ancestors, and I make a point of learning about at least some more information about one particular family ancestor every Samhain.
Okay.
This year, in the night, in preparation for this show, I was up doing some meditation in the middle of the night, and a very distant cousin that I met via the internet had sent me a packet, and I opened it up at that time, and lo and behold, for the first time, I saw a picture of my great-grandfather, David Bissett, from Scotland.
Okay.
It is now sitting on my ancestors' altar.
Okay.
And so I do some work to try to get more family history, whether it's getting a photograph or getting a tale or looking over materials that I already have, or going out on the internet and doing Google searches. I endeavored to do something with family ancestors as part of my Samhain work. And most people I know who do ancestor work during Samhain really focus on a family ancestor or family ancestors as a whole. But I've found, as part of my practice of what I call ancestor magic, that there are two other kinds of ancestors that we can also honor at this time of year. One of those would be ancestors of place and culture.
Yes.
And those of us who are Americans, for example, would look at who are our national heroes who have crossed over.
Yes.
Who are those who, and so whether it's founding father, founding mother, those could be construed as ancestors. And indeed, when I was doing work on the Veterans Pinnacle Quest, I not only called on a family ancestor, James Kinsey, who was part of the First Continental Congress, and Colonel John Weems, who was with George Washington in the Revolutionary War, and Philip Barr, who was with him at Valley Forge, and a number of other Revolutionary War ancestors. I called on founding fathers and founding mothers of our country as ancestors to
Nice.
help with the quest.
I have just enough Cherokee blood in me to say I have a little Cherokee blood in me. And one of the discussions that we got into was, okay, if we bring all of our Celtic gods to America, there are Cherokee gods and Cherokee spirits of place. Do we honor them, or are there just different names for the same spirits and the same gods? And so that's, I'm not trying to get into a debate about that, but I think it's an interesting concept that do you honor the spirits of place in the place that you find yourself, or how does that work?
Well, and I find that another interesting connection between you and me, because we both have ancestors that in America with European roots that go back to the 1700s, early ancestors. But I also am part Cherokee.
Great.
So in addition to having a picture of my great-grandmother, who had Cherokee ancestry on my ancestors' altar, I honor and work with Cherokee ancestors as part of my family connection, but being part of Native American powwows and other events where I'm connecting with people of a number of different tribal traditions. I pay respects to those ancient ones of America that went before, whether I'm genetically descended from them or not. I lived in a forest which is part of the forest that goes into Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve. I have land that adjoins Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve. And at the gateway between our property and the Circle Sanctuary property is some ancient Indian places. When I do ancestral work there of ancestors of place, I pay respect to those ancient peoples that most likely I am not genetically descended from, but I consider them a kind of ancestor as well, because their spirits are within the land. And I'm now living on the land, and if I'm going to be working with the spirit of place, I'm going to be working with that spirit of place not only in the here and now, but through the ages, into the past, as well as into the future, because how we relate to the land in the present does impact the future. So I'm certainly, I guess, in that whole exploring how to deal with cultural ancestors and ancestors of place. For me, that is also an important part of ancestral practice.
And this is going to sound like a tangent, but I'm hoping to tie it all together here. You and I, you mentioned your psychology major. I actually came to, I'm a family therapist myself. I came to that from my pagan practices. Somebody at one of the gatherings I was at way early on had mentioned Carl Jung and his work with the collective unconscious and those types of archetypes and things like that. And I started reading him and said, hey, maybe I need to do this for a living. But the idea behind that is his idea of the collective unconscious, and that we're all linked together at some level. And the knowledge and the wisdom of the ancestors is buried deep within our unconscious minds, and that we have access to that when we honor those ancestors, that sort of thing. I'm probably paraphrasing quite a bit here about his original intent was, but...
Well, and I know that certainly in my studies of Jung and being able to see some reproductions of some of his books and I have some of his writings, and I've also seen a beautiful illuminated manuscript that he put together as kind of his own private spiritual journal,
the magical Red Book.
I first saw that when I was in Amsterdam a year or so ago, and it was in one of the bookstores in one of the shops, and I was just struck by how beautiful it was and how much he had those powerful symbols depicted within the book as part. So the words, yes, important, but seeing the beautiful images that transcend any language barrier, how powerful is that?
Yes.
Well, the third part of ancestors that I work with as part of ancestral work at Samhain is spiritual ancestors.
Yeah.
And while Carl Jung wouldn't necessarily call himself a pagan,
Yeah.
he certainly has been among those in my own spiritual practice that has informed my understanding of spirituality, and I would consider him a spiritual ancestor.
Yes.
So I encourage people, whatever their tradition that they're practicing, to look at those who've gone before. In fact, in among some pagans, there has been a movement to try to gather together the names of pagan leaders and teachers from a variety of different organizations and traditions who have died, and to have that list of names available not only to read for those people who do that kind of work as part of their rituals, but just to be aware of those who have gone before. And certainly as part of our Samhain gatherings, we have a time in our big community ritual, and I'm generally the facilitator of this part, where we open an ancestral portal, we pay respects to our own personal loved ones who are now in the realm of the dead, but we'll pay special respects to those, whether we're related to them or not, who have been part of our spiritual life, who have crossed over in the past year. And certainly in this past year, a number of pagan elders have crossed, and so our naming of them is going to take a bit of time.
Yes. Our order is particularly involved in trying to recapture Celtic shamanism. And I was just wondering how much work you've done in that area, and if you would like to speak a bit on that.
Yeah, it's definitely near and dear to my heart. And I find that my experience of shamanism has, in addition to working with it in a more universalist, multicultural way, that particular forms of culture that are part of the path that I walk, and the Celtic path is part of that, I will endeavor to not only learn, but to share what I've learned, to share the stories with others, to be able to tell stories, to do libations and other offerings. And the languaging around the other world, or some call it Anavan, depending on whether you're from a Welsh tradition or some other path, or the Tir Nonog, the land of eternal youth. I do think that part of the work that one can do in shamanic spirituality of a Celtic form is to really look at survivals of ancient practices that have come down to us in lore and in legend, in the stories, in the art, and using those as portals for connecting with the wisdom and the peoples and the practices of the past. Yes, we aren't going to recycle all the ancient practices, but certainly I find when I go to Bridget Spring or Bride Spring or Breed Spring at Circle Sanctuary Nature Preserve, named after that Celtic goddess, not only of smithcraft and healing and inspiration, but she was a goddess of the sacred waters. And we have a spring that bubbles up year-round. In addition to physically going to the spring, putting ribbons and strips of cloth around the spring, as was done in, some call it clothie or clothy customs, well-dressing. I see the spring as a means for entering that other world, to use it in meditation and visualization, whether I'm physically present at that spring or not. And I do think that the idea of offering, the idea of sharing lore, the idea of going between the worlds in an intentional and good way where one is centered and one shifts consciousness, allows us not only to connect with those who have gone before in their wisdom, but to have a dynamic relationship that can help evolve our own personal practice, the practice of the group or groups of people we are part of, as well as that larger circle of paganism and humanity that we're part of.
Yes, that's another hot topic around the moots, the moot fires here, is how much of that wisdom is returning now that we have acknowledged the ancestors again. It seems like we went through a period of time, and then when I say we, I mean American culture, where we didn't rely so much on the ancestral knowledge, and now we're kind of coming back to that. And what I see in the gatherings that I have experienced is that this knowledge is coming back, and all these different isolated groups are experiencing knowledge from shamanic journeying, and then getting together and finding out that these experiences are lining up with each other. So we're reclaiming.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
True. And we're out of time, but if our listeners would like to learn more about you, would you give us your website and any other contact information you would like to give?
Yes, you can connect with me at the Circle Sanctuary website, www.circlesanctuary.org, at my website, www.selenafox.com, or my main page on Facebook, which is Selena Fox Updates. And those are some ways to connect. You can also reach me at Circle Sanctuary, circlesanctuary.org. Or you can Google us, and it'll take us to one of the sites, and you'll be able to connect. I want to give thanks to you for doing this show. I want to give thanks to the ancestors of many peoples and many paths, and wish everyone a wonderful Samhain.
And thank you for being on the show, and thank you for everything you do for the pagan community.
Well, great being here, and may we all have a blessed Samhain and a happy New Year.
Ancestor shining ones, guide us with your wisdom. Ancestor shining ones who've gone before. Ancestor shining ones, may the gate be open. Ancestor shining ones, join us at the door. Ancestor shining ones, guide us with your wisdom. Ancestor shining ones who've gone before. Ancestor shining ones, may the gates be open. Ancestor shining ones, join us at the door. Ancestor shining ones, guide us with your wisdom. Ancestor shining ones who've gone before. Ancestor shining ones, may the gates be open. Ancestor shining ones, join us at the door. Ancestor shining ones, guide us with your wisdom. Ancestor shining ones who've gone before. Ancestor shining ones, may the gates be open. Ancestor shining ones, join us at the door.
The Way of the Taibhsear Handbook is now available. The Way of the Taibhsear is the official handbook of the Order of the Taibhsear. Taibhsear is a Scots Gaelic word for shaman. It means vision seeker or seer. This year in a day study guide gives you a good basic foundation in druidry and vision seeking as practiced by the Order of the Taibhsear. Get yours today at Amazon or most major media outlets. What is life? It's the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It's the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. Crowfoot, Blackfoot Warrior. There was a time not so long ago when a loved one's remains were allowed to return to the earth. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There were no chemical pollutants to seep into the groundwater, and the deceased re-entered the circle of life by returning to the earth from which they came. Then along came the Industrial Revolution with its better living through chemistry. Now we pump our dearly departed ones full of chemicals so that they literally become plastic mannequins upon burial. Perhaps this is the final irony in an age of plastic people. There is, however, a better way to complete this journey on the earth. Green burial is a more natural, sustainable way of burial that returns to the burial methods of our ancestors. I first heard of green burial when a natural burial preserve opened in my home state of South Carolina. Ramsey Creek Preserve opened in 1996, the first green cemetery in the United States. Ramsey Creek was founded when Dr. William Campbell of Oconee Memorial Hospital got the idea from his research on Borneo spirit forests, in which the tribes of Borneo bury their dead in completely undisturbed memorial forests. Ramsey Creek is modeled on the spirit forest concept. There are several reasons to consider internment in a green burial cemetery. Burial is commonly practiced in the United States, along with the bodies of the deceased, causes the annual burial of 30 million board feet of hardwoods, 1.6 million tons of reinforced concrete, 827,000 gallons of embalming fluid, 104,200 tons of steel, and 2,700 tons of bronze and copper. Choosing a green burial alternative eliminates most of this waste while preserving the environment. The first and foremost obvious advantage of green burial is that it doesn't rely on formaldehyde or other chemicals to preserve the dead. Currently, no state or province in North America routinely requires the embalming of a body before burial. So if a mortician tells you that embalming is a requirement, ask to see it in writing. There may be special instances in which decomposition has already begun or in which there will be a long period of time between death and burial, but in general, embalming is not necessary. Formaldehyde, one of the chemicals used in the embalming process, has been listed by the Environmental Protection Agency as a potential carcinogen. When bodies are embalmed, there's always the potential of the embalming chemicals seeping into the groundwater and causing contamination. Green burial doesn't use formaldehyde or other chemicals to embalm the body. Instead, the body is allowed to decompose naturally. If the body must be preserved for travel or until funeral arrangements are made, refrigeration or dry ice storage is just as effective as embalming. Some funeral directors will tell you that without embalming, there's the danger that the decomposing body could contaminate the groundwater with germs or other pathogens. The claim is that the embalming process eliminates these pathogens. While human bodies contain bacteria and other germs at the time of death, most become inactive within a matter of days due to the fact that most of them require a living host in order to remain alive. Even those that don't require a host are largely inert within 5 years. In order for a naturally decomposing body to pollute the surrounding groundwater, the germs would first have to percolate from the gravesite into the water supply. This involves traveling through many yards of sand, gravel, stone, and clay before reaching the groundwater. Such a process takes many years, and by the time the pathogens have traveled such a distance, it is highly likely that they have become inert. Studies have indicated that unless a large number of bodies are buried directly above the water table within a short period of time, the chances of contaminating the groundwater are remote. Even then, you would only be at risk if you drank untreated well water from a distance of less than 100 feet from the burial site. Studies suggest that you're in more danger of contamination from surface water runoff that passes over dead animal carcasses than from a natural human burial site. At any rate, most bodies that are not embalmed are placed in cold storage for some period of time until funeral arrangements can be made. Evidence suggests that prolonged periods of refrigeration greatly reduce or eliminate altogether many pathogens. Refrigeration helps to minimize the risk of such contamination for the same reason that food doesn't go bad in your refrigerator. If your green burial site is also a natural preserve, it is kept in as natural a state as possible with little disturbance. This means that there's no use of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals that are routinely employed in the landscaping of more commercial cemeteries. Such chemicals pollute the groundwater far more than any natural decomposition of a human remain would. Also, in a natural preserve cemetery, no water is used for irrigation of lawns or shrubs or other plants. And of course, since green burial sites use no embalming, there's no danger of such chemicals escaping into the groundwater. Some people are concerned that in a natural preserve, the wild animals might disturb the bodies. Since green burial doesn't use a vault, would animals be able to dig up the bodies? Not really. There's a reason bodies are buried 6 feet under the ground. Imagine digging a grave by yourself with just a shovel. Now imagine that instead of a shovel, all you had to dig with was a set of claws on the end of each hand. How long do you think you'd keep at it before you finally gave up? Also, even though most animals have a keen sense of smell, it's highly unlikely they'd be able to scent a body under 6 feet of dirt. In the entire history of Ramsey Creek Preserve here in South Carolina, an area with wild coyotes and even the occasional black bear, there's never been a single instance of an animal disturbing a gravesite. I'd be willing to bet that that is also true of any other green burial site in the United States or in the world. Another benefit of green burial is that such burials are much less expensive. While a commercial funeral runs anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000, most green burials cost less than $2,000. A large part of this is due to the fact that in a green burial, the coffin or casket must be biodegradable. Green burials tend to use soft woods that decompose rapidly, or wicker basket caskets, or cloth shrouds made of natural materials. Softwoods, wicker, and cloth shrouds are much less expensive than commercially produced steel-lined coffins. Another benefit of the green burial is that it can be used to preserve natural sites for future generations. There are two general categories for natural preservation of green burial sites as defined by memorial ecosystems: conservation burial grounds and natural burial grounds. A conservation burial ground is a green cemetery that has formed a partnership with an established conservation partner, for example, a nonprofit conservation group, and that restricts future use of the cemetery to green burial through use of a conservation easement. A natural burial ground uses a deed restriction rather than a conservation easement and does not require the stewardship of a conservation group. In either case, the land is set aside for exclusive use as a natural burial cemetery. The added bonus to this type of contract is that it preserves woodland sites from future development for any other purpose than a green burial, thereby conserving the forest. I'd be very skeptical of any green burial cemetery that didn't operate under some sort of conservation contract in this manner. The green burial movement is still in its infancy in America. It may be difficult to find a green burial site in your immediate area. Even so, there are over 200 registered green burial cemeteries in the United States. If you can't find one where you live, consider finding a more traditional cemetery that'll work with you. There's no state in the United States that requires embalming prior to burial, although some cemeteries may insist on it. If your local cemetery won't allow green burial, ask them to suggest someone who will. Don't forget that funeral parlors make a lot of money off of the embalming process, so they may be reluctant to offer burial services without embalming first. Be prepared for some resistance. If you've decided that green burial is an option you'd like to entertain for yourself or for your family, there are a few considerations to address when selecting cemeteries and planning funeral services. Being from the rural South, I'm old enough to remember a time when open casket services were held in the home. I'm not sure when or why funerals moved out of the home and into the funeral parlor, but there's no good reason why a home funeral cannot be held today. In addition to adding up the huge cost savings, home funerals also allow family members to grieve for the departed in a more familiar and therefore more natural environment. Seeing the departed for one last time in a familiar place may facilitate the grieving process and make recovery easier for family and friends. There's no rush to complete the ceremony, so each individual can say goodbye in his or her own way without feeling rushed. Natural burials are a nice complement to home funerals in that they both return control of the funeral process to the family. If you expect an elaborate headstone for your grave, then you may have a difficult time finding a green burial site. About the only potential drawback to green burial is that most green burial cemeteries don't allow large decorative gravestones. This is in order to preserve the natural look and feel of a burial site. Many do, however, allow a flat stone of natural appearance. Some also allow minimal engraving on the stone, usually just basic information like the name of the deceased and the dates of birth and death. As an alternative to the headstone, many green burial sites will allow you to plant some sort of memorial shrub or flower or even tree on the gravesite. The common stipulation there is that the plant must be indigenous to the region. Many green burial cemeteries have lists of approved plants, and some offer names of local suppliers who carry such plants. In general, they don't allow elaborate pruning or other landscaping activities. Again, the goal is to preserve the burial site in as natural a state as possible. Some green burial cemeteries don't allow any sort of gravestone or other marker. This doesn't mean, however, that your loved one's gravesite will be lost forever. Most preserves use modern surveying techniques to preserve the location of each site. Each location is preserved in a database maintained by the facility. To preserve the memory of the deceased, many green burial sites also offer archiving services that will allow you to store biographical and genealogical information permanently in their filing system. Some also create memorials on the internet. Prior to learning about green burial, I had planned to be cremated. Cremated seemed to be the option of choice among most of my environmentalist friends until they learned about green burial. The theory behind cremation is that it doesn't use up land for a funeral plot, and it doesn't rely on the heavily toxic embalming chemicals. While this is true, cremation does use up several thousand BTUs of energy during the process of burning the bodies. When you consider that most crematoria fire their incinerators using fossil fuels, cremation doesn't sound quite so green anymore. With green burial, the conscientious environmentalist has another option. Natural burial allows your remains to return to the soil, becoming a source of nutrients for the flora and the fauna of the site. If you've your mind made up about cremation, most green burial cemeteries will also allow you to bury your ashes on the site. Many, however, restrict the scattering of ashes. This is because of the potential for contamination of the soil due to surface water runoff. If you decided to go this route, try to find a crematorium that uses the most energy-efficient incinerators possible. All funeral arrangements go more smoothly if they are planned ahead of time. This is especially true when unusual arrangements are made, such as green burial. If you've chosen this option for yourself or for anyone else in your family, now is the time to start working on the details. If you're fortunate enough to have a green burial cemetery nearby, call or pay them a visit to see what services and options they offer. Discuss funeral arrangements with them. A good funeral director can offer suggestions you may not have considered, and it's better to make such decisions ahead of time. After the death of a loved one, family members will be under a lot of stress and grief, and decisions are much more difficult to make under those conditions. The more you can plan for now, the less you'll have to worry about when the time comes. A green natural burial seems to me to be the perfect end to a life lived caring for the earth in a sustainable way. With natural burial, death doesn't have to be the final green circle. I can think of no better way to be put to rest than among the trees and the animals of the forest, where my family members may enjoy the peaceful sights and sounds of nature, while my body feeds the soil. It's a far better way to honor the death and the life of an individual. John Muir said it best in his book, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. On no subject are our ideas more warped and pitiable than on death. Instead of the sympathy, the friendly union of life and death so apparent in nature, we are taught that death is an accident, a deplorable punishment for the oldest sin, the arch-enemy of life. But let children walk with nature. Let them see the beautiful blendings and communions of death and life, their joyous, inseparable unity, as taught in the woods, plains, and mountains and streams of our blessed star. And they will learn that death is stingless indeed, and as beautiful as life, and that the grave has no victory, for it never fights. All is divine harmony. You've been listening to the Way of the Taibhsear Podcast on International Pagan Radio, where it's all pagan all the time. This has been episode 53, Samhain 2016, with my guest Selena Fox of Circle Sanctuary. The Way of the Taibhsear is the official podcast of the Order of the Taibhsear. You can learn more about us at taibhsear.com. That's TAIBHSEAR.com. Music for this episode was Ancestor Chant from the album Tears Upon the Water. The Way of the Taibhsear is a podcast about Druidry and paganism as practiced by the Order of the Taibhsear. Paganism is a wide and diverse community, and we don't claim to speak for all pagans. Did you know that you can download older episodes of the podcast from SoundCloud? Visit soundcloud.com and search for Schenka the Vate or The Way of the Taibhsear Podcast. The Way of the Taibhsear is sponsored by Elder Grove Seminary. Learn more about Elder Grove at eldergroveseminary.com. Join us for the Gathering of the Bards coming in October of 2017. You can learn more about the Gathering of the Bards at gatheringofthebards.com. Until next time, blessings of the ancestors.